games that pretty much everyone has played. Part of that is because it's just a damn good game, but it's also largely because it's been released on almost every system imaginable. Doom has been released, if I'm not mistaken, on close to 12.5 different platforms since its original release in 1993. While most versions, especially the early console versions, have their own inclusions and exclusions that make them somewhat distinct, the version I played through start to finish is the Switch port, and that's probably my favorite port of the game, excluding running it on a modern PC at 240 frames per second. Doom so far has been ported from the original MS-DOS release to Super Nintendo, Sega 32X, 3DO, Atari Jaguar, Sony PlayStation, Sega Saturn, the NEC PC-98, the Xbox 360, the Xbox One, the Xbox Series, PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, Game Boy Advance, iOS, and Android. And I am probably forgetting one. Doom's story is pretty simple. You play as an unnamed space marine, usually referred to by fans either as Doom Guy or, for the later games, Doomslayer, who was transferred to Mars after assaulting a superior officer who ordered his unit to fire on civilians. Or at least that's the lore no one cares about. Your Doom Guy is acting as security for a company experimenting with a transporter to instantly move people between Mars' two moons, Phobos and Deimos. Unfortunately, what they did was open a portal to Hell. And the next thing you know, just about everybody's dead, and there are demons and possessed marines running around killing. Now, because I've always liked side-by-side comparisons, I'm going to be comparing 12 versions of Doom here, all captured on real hardware. We're going to go through the 32X version, the Jaguar version, the Super Nintendo version, PlayStation version, 3DO, Saturn, Game Boy Advance, Xbox, Xbox 360, Xbox Series X, and the Switch versions. We're also going to be looking at the PC version, although not the original MS-DOS, because I don't have a DOS computer, and I don't like emulation, except as an absolute last resort. The 32X version of Doom is not great. The performance is pretty bad, with a really choppy frame rate. The game window is very small, and there's no option to use the CD for good audio. It is widely considered one of the worst ports, but Doom really wasn't intended to run on what is really just a Sega Genesis on steroids. The Atari Jaguar port, despite being later to market than the 32X, was actually the first one developed. It is the fastest console port at the time, runs at a pretty decent speed, 15, 20 frames a second, somewhere around there, not great by today's standards. Resolution's not great, and some of the visual effects are removed, and there's no music whatsoever, but it features more of the levels than the 32X did, with 22 out of 27, whereas the 32X only had 17. It's a pretty good port for the most part, but the Jaguar's controller does make it feel really clunky to play. Super Nintendo version is what I started with, but going back to it is tough. The textures are heavily compressed. Resolution is not great, but it does have most of the PC levels, and the music is intact. It's honestly really impressive that this can run on the Super Nintendo at all, although it is worth noting that it relies on the Super FX2 chip in the cartridge to be able to run. The PlayStation port was pretty good. They redrew some of the assets, so the game looks better. There's colored lighting in the PS1 version, which really makes for a good ambiance, and the ambient sounds are a lot better. Gameplay is pretty smooth, sort of what you would expect from a 32-bit system, as opposed to the 32X, which was a 16-bit system that was really playing outside of its weight class. The colored lighting really gives it a moody atmosphere, and in my opinion, the PS1 version is probably the best pre-2000s console port. The Saturn version was based on the PlayStation version, but it performs way worse. The Saturn in a lot of ways was stronger than the PlayStation, but mainly in 2D games. PlayStation had the upper hand in 3D games, and that really kind of shows here, because the Saturn struggles with this. Other than the really bad performance, there's not a whole lot of differences between the PlayStation and Saturn versions. But that performance on the Saturn version is just really hard to take. The 3DO version of the game is god-awful. Honestly, it's the worst version here. The graphics are in a small window, even smaller than 32X, and it's really pixelated. The frame rate is genuinely, literally single-digit, like 5 to 8 frames per second. Look at Digital Foundry's video, they go a lot more in-depth with that. The audio is good. It does use Red Book audio quality, but that really does not make up for the fact that it's got fewer levels, awful performance, the visuals look bad, and while it was based on the Jaguar version, it's kind of hard to tell by gameplay. Now, in Rebecca Heinemann's defense, she's the programmer who reverse engineered the Jaguar version, she had about 10 weeks to get this whole port done, and that is not a lot of time, especially when you're taking one version, reverse engineering it, and making it work on a different console. She's a good developer, but this was not a project she would have been able to do well. Other than maybe the Super Nintendo version, what I think is the most impressive port is the Game Boy Advance. Sure, it was technically a 32-bit system, but it's a handheld. The graphics are really scaled down, the resolution's very low, although that really isn't a big problem given the tiny screen. It doesn't have lighting effects, but that's not really surprising. It does, however, include all of the levels from Doom. And while the music quality is reduced, it's not terrible. For a handheld in 2001, I honestly think the GBA version of Doom is pretty decent. 2005's Xbox port, packaged in with Doom 3 Collector's Edition, was when we finally got a perfect, or very close to, console version. The frame rate is smooth, the controls are responsive, performance is perfect. The graphics look amazing, very faithful to the original MS-DOS version, and it runs in full screen with pretty good resolution for the time. Music's great, sound effects are great. Using the dual analog control of the original Xbox makes the game feel very comfortable for modern players, even without any Y-axis aiming. Genuinely, this is the best pre-HD version. Fast forward 7 years, and we have the Doom 3 BFG edition coming out in 2012 for the Xbox 360 with a remastered version of Doom. Again, as you would expect from a system as powerful as a 360, perfect performance, HD resolution, and they add in achievements, which is a really cool thing for folks diving back into the game. It got criticized for some minor episodes of censorship, but what are you going to do? Core gameplay is retained, and that's really the most important thing. Now, I'm kind of going to lump Switch, modern PC, and Series X all in together, because they're all basically the same modern port. They're all perfect in how they run, perfect resolution, full screen, restored music, redone music, some quality of life features. The only big difference is your frame rate. Switch, obviously, is going to max out at 60 frames per second. The Series X can do up to 120 frames per second, and if you're playing on Steam and you have a monitor that can support it, I was playing at 240 frames per second, which is a buttery smoothness I did not know existed. I'm not going to say that there's no bad version of Doom. The 3DO and Super Nintendo versions exist, as does Sega Saturn. However, every version of Doom is interesting. It is worth experiencing, because they all have kind of a different feel with how each console handled it, especially since this has been ported from 4th gen consoles with the Genesis via 32X and the Super Nintendo, all the way up to modern 9th gen consoles. Depending on what version of the game you play, the game is broken into either 3 or 4 parts. The original game being 3 parts, and then the last 4th part being released in the updated version, the Ultimate Doom. The Switch port and most of the modern versions have all 4 chapters. The first 3 are Knee-Deep in the Dead, The Shores of Hell, and Inferno, and then the last chapter that sort of bridges the first game with Doom 2 is Thy Flesh Consumed. All 4 parts are a lot of fun, but Thy Flesh Consumed has a bizarre difficulty curve. The first couple of levels are some of the hardest levels of the entire game, and then the 3rd and 4th level of that 4th episode are significantly easier than the first 2. They're still hard, but nothing like what it throws you into right at the beginning of the chapter. By today's standards, Doom definitely hasn't aged very well in the visuals department. After all, it was released before 3D technology was really a common thing. But the gameplay holds up just as well today as it did in the 90s. The fast and fluid gameplay, the simple point-and-shoot gameplay, and the hordes of demons and undead to slay make for an amazing experience, even in 2025. The relatively short length of the levels makes it a perfect game to pick up and play for a little while at a time. Gotta take a poop? Grab your Switch and kill some demons. Waiting at the doctor's office? Grab your Switch and slaughter some Barons of Hell. Wife shopping for purses? Grab your Switch and massacre some imps. The soundtrack is also absolutely amazing, and honestly one of the best parts of the game. The original soundtrack sounds fantastic with that early 90s, by our standards, primitive computer audio, and in the most recent releases that Bethesda did for PS5, Series X, PC, and Switch, you get the option for a totally re-recorded, reimagined, modern-day version of the soundtrack. And while I have a lot of nostalgia for the original, the redo is amazing. As I mentioned before, the difficulty curve really gets screwed up in Thy Flesh Consumed. The first 3 episodes have pretty standard, reasonable difficulty curve. With the exception of the final boss, Knee-Deep in Hell is really pretty easy once you get a feel for the controls. Shores of Hell, the second one, really increases the difficulty, and it's a lot harder if you just start from the pistol, but if you sort of know what you're doing and you practice at the levels, it's fine. Inferno, with the 3rd episode, does get really tough. Lots of environmental hazards, hordes of increasingly powerful enemies, and a constantly dwindling ammo supply makes those levels a pretty tough challenge. It always feels like a natural progression, though, a fairly constant incline of difficulty. And then you hit Thy Flesh Consumed, and it's just all over the place. It feels like just some random levels thrown together haphazardly, and in some sense, that's sort of what it was. It was like, well, let's just make some more Doom levels, but the difficulty is really up and down like a roller coaster. Whether you dust off the red SNES cartridge, rock the silent glory of the Atari Jaguar port, unleash the Tower of Power for the Sega 32X, or kill on the go with Switch, Doom is a damn good time. It's violent as hell, pun intended, with gore for days, but it is endlessly satisfying to play. It's a definite challenge as you get on in the levels, but it's a challenge worth tackling and feels extremely satisfying to finish. I found myself getting hopelessly lost in a lot of these levels, and a 3-minute par would have me finish in 20 minutes, but at no point did it stop being fun. Super frustrating, but always fun. My rating for Doom for MS-DOS, Sega 32X, Atari Jaguar, Super Nintendo, PlayStation, 3DO, PC 9801, Sega Saturn, Gameboy Advance, Xbox, Xbox 360, Xbox One, Xbox Series X, PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, Nintendo Switch, iOS, Android, and Steam is an A.